Ms. Mattei, would fascism or neo-fascism be inevitable consequences of the austerity policy?
The question you asked me is a crucial question that I have been researching. And I think the way I developed the question in the Capital Order in my book is slightly different from how it has been done before. What I want to show is not that fascism is the exception to the norm, but actually how fascism and capitalism are very much allies in preserving the capital order. So what I show in the book is that Benito Mussolini, the founding father of fascism that came to power in 1922, was loved by all of the economic elite, especially the liberal elite, for his capacity to actually suppress working class demands in a moment, in a historical moment after the First World War, in which workers had gained a lot of bargaining power and a lot of political imagination to ask for alternative ways to organize society, to organize production and distribution. So in a moment in which workers all over, for example, Western Europe, were organizing with councils, both in the countryside and in factories, to claim economic democracy, this is what Mussolini was great at doing, was quashing workers' capacities to organize by directly implementing austerity. So austerity was very well done by Benito Mussolini because the state intervened directly, for example, to outlaw unions and to repress wages in a way that was even more radical than what was happening, for example, in Great Britain, in which the Bank of England and the Treasury were trying to do the same policies, but had to revert to the mediation of the market, meaning that they tried to basically increase interest rates. This is what they did. They increased interest rates so that they could cause a depression, and this ultimately had the effect of quashing workers. But let's say that fascism, especially in moments in which workers are most embattled, is the best companion or the best political regime, let's put it, for capitalism to function in order indeed to preserve the pillars of our capitalist economy, namely wage relations and private property of the means of production. Once Mussolini came to power, the expectations for profits of investors, both within Italy and outside, grew immensely. So that actually foreign capital was again attracted to Italy. Investors started coming in and the country grew economically while the population was suffering low wages, precariousness, and the privatization of all resources. So this is how we can understand it historically. Now, the question you ask is tricky because we also know that right now, as we speak, many authoritarian, right-wing, call it fascist governments, if you like, have grown exactly because austerity has been very successful in the last decades or more in making people more vulnerable and more individualistic. So people have bought into the logic of austerity and the narrative of economists who tell us that if we're poor, it's our fault and we should actually blame the poorest. So that actually people think that these governments may represent an alternative to what has made them suffer until that point, right? So in a way, in my country, in Italy, the reason why Giorgia Meloni came to power and she recognized she is explicitly in the legacy of Benito Mussolini is because people saw in her someone who would do something different from the liberal technocratic elite that governed before her. Now, guess what? She did nothing different and actually did more austerity by fundamentally even cutting the very little money the poor families were getting, called the citizenship income. Okay, so austerity, once again, with authoritarian governments can be even more powerful. But I do think that the fact that there's a lot of right-wing governments emerging speaks to the fact that all governments from the left and for the right in the last decades have implemented austerity, created a situation of impoverishment, not just material, but also in the political awareness and imagination of people. Now, this does not mean, and this for me is very important because I go against a lot of my colleagues who tell me, oh, it's the end of history. We can't imagine anything else outside of capitalism. This is the opposite message I wanted to give. I want to give the message that actually fascist governments are coercive because people have the tendency to constantly actually mobilize against the system. So even if austerity keeps hitting, and it hits hard, and it individualizes us, the reality is that alternatives are always present. And this is why, for example, in this historical moment, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, and many other banks around the world have increased the interest rates because they're worried about workers getting together, trying to change things. And this is what has been happening in the United States as we speak. Workers have won many battles. We don't talk about this, but actually many battles have been won by unions in the United States. New unions are emerging. Workers are claiming a share of the GDP like never before. And this is the moment in which austerity hits again, bites hard as a way to protect the capital order. So the message here is, of course, fascism, a great ally to capitalism. Again, fascism, not an exception, but actually not something different from capitalism, but actually the best expression of it. But at the same time, the fact that this does not mean that we can't consider our economy as a political object that thus can continue to change and people can actively participate in changing it.